You have the acetyl-CoA, the universal metabolic currency. All products of digestion, including sugars, sugars we're talking about here is carbohydrates, including fatty acid, including what? Amino acid. Fatty acid we're talking about here is lipid. Amino acid we're talking about here is what? Um, uh, Proteins are ultimately converted to a single common product called acetyl-CoA. So here is something you have to have in your mind is when you eat carbohydrate, the byproduct is simple sugars. An example of simple sugars are glucose. When you consume lipid, the byproducts of lipid are most times glycerols and fatty acid. When you consume proteins, most of the byproducts are amino acid. So what is happening? All these byproducts, they will end up forming what we call what? Acetyl-CoA. As you can see there, they will end up forming acetyl-CoA. Why? Is because acetyl-CoA is now what will now enter the mitochondria in the presence of energy, in the presence of ATP and oxygen, the presence of oxygen to produce what we call energy, the ATP required by our body. So carbohydrate, lipid and protein, these are they serve as major nutrients, and this is how proteins also serve as energy giving food during what? During starvation. And lipid also serve as energy giving food because proteins, when you lack energy and carbohydrates and lipid have been completely used up, this protein will be later converted back to acetyl-CoA, which will now yield what? Glucose, which is required by our body, and lipid will be converted back to acetyl-CoA, which will now yield what? The energy required in our body. So that's the citric acid cycle, cashing in the currency of the energy. So acetyl-CoA enters the citric acid cycle. So you can see that yellow settings there are called the acid citric cycle. So these yellow diagrams there are the citric acid cycle, and it occurs in the what? In the matrix of the mitochondria. The matrix of the mitochondria means the space within the mitochondria where we have the intermembrane and the outer membrane, and where we have cytosol of the organelles and organelles of the mitochondria. Remember, we are summarizing. So the citric acid cycle, where it is oxidized to produce carbon dioxide, reducing equivalent and ultimately ATP, the energy that powers our cell. Don't worry, if you are not getting it right, you should have something in mind that this is like a type of summary and this is an overview. So just make sure you follow the playlist accordingly. So when we start discussing about the pathway, you will understand all these things better. Just remember that acetyl-CoA enters the citric acid cycle where it is oxidized to produce carbon dioxide, reducing equivalents and ultimately ATP, the energy that powers our cell. Remember, acetyl-CoA will enter to produce most times 3 molecules, which are it will be oxidized to release what? Carbon dioxide. That is why when you are breathing in oxygen, you are taking out what? Carbon dioxide. We are oxidizing carbon to carbon dioxide, and that is what's called decarboxylation. And we are forming reducing equivalent. What are the reducing equivalent? We have the NADPH, we have the NADH, we have the FADH. All these things will end up to release 2 electrons and hydrogen ions in the midst of the mitochondria, which will now create gradients, hydrogen gradients that will now start producing energy in the mitochondria. Ultimately, ATP, the energy and the powerhouse of the cells, are constantly what's produced in this process. So we have the effect of glucose more than just fuel. So when glucose in our body, glucose is a major for most tissue, but it is metabolic journey is remarkably diverse. So when glucose enters our body, it undergoes so many processes depending on what the body needs. So our body most times it requires energy. So our body will keep on converting this glucose to pyruvate by a process known as what? Glycolysis. Our body is converting glucose to pyruvate by a process known as what? Glycolysis, and it most time require ATP for this reaction to occur and also end up producing a little amount of energy for the process to be complete. So this pyruvate, in the presence of oxygen, it will now enter, it will now be decarboxylated to form acetyl-CoA that will now enter into the citric acid cycle to produce energy. But pyruvate, in the absence of oxygen, it will now start converting to the what? To lactate, which is stored in the muscle for constant peak of energy. So when you constantly start running, or when you're doing something that constantly drains your energy, what's happened? And whenever there is absence of this oxygen, you see your body starts converting these pyruvates to what? To lactate, which will now supply minimum so little amount of energy, which is 2 molecules of ATP that you use. So when you start playing football or start running, what's happening? You are constantly using energy and there is not much oxygen that is coming to the body. So your body starts converting all these pyruvate to lactate and producing minimum amount of energy. So but when there is enough oxygen, this lactates will be converted back to pyruvate, then to acetyl-CoA to produce the main energy. So that is why after running for a long while, when you rest, you start breathing faster. You are breathing faster so that you can take in oxygen and start converting all these lactates back towards acetyl-CoA, which will now undergo the citric acid cycle in the electron chain in the mitochondria to produce what? Energy. That's what happened. So what else happened? We have the storage of glucose, which we now call what? Glycogen. We store glucose in the liver for a minimum amount of time. So this glycogen is stored in the liver so that or in the muscle. Glycogen, and which enzyme is released? Insulin. Remember, whenever there is hyperglycemia, meaning high level of glucose, insulin is always released, and whenever there is low level of glucose, hypoglycemia, glucagon is released. So we store this glucose form of what? Glycogen, so that whenever there is low amount of glucose, we call it what? Hypoglycemia, an enzyme called glucagon is released to start breaking down this glycogen. So it also undergo the pentose phosphate pathway to produce ribose for DNA and RNA in your nucleic acid. So it also undergoes the building blocks, which called the precursor for fatty acid and non-essential amino acid. So glucose is also converted to fatty acid. So this process of converting glucose to fatty acid is what's called lipogenesis. So we also convert this to non-essential amino acid. So take a break. Have you heard of essential amino acid and non-essential amino acid? So essential amino acid are those. So first, why are they called essential and why are they called non-essential? We call them essential because they cannot be produced by the body. Our body can't synthesize them. So this is the reason we call it essential. And we call it non-essential because our body can synthesize this amino acid. So essential amino acid are 9, while our non-essential are what? 11. So those non-essential amino acid that our body can synthesize, those non-essential amino acid that our body cannot synthesize, those essential amino acid are the one our body can synthesize, while non-essential are the one our body can't synthesize. So we have lipid